Hi, it's Roz, and it's Wednesday morning before work, and I'm trying to squeeze in another little scally-dandle around some books. And last time we were in Greece in the early 20th century, and this time we're going to the ancient Greek world, because I've been reading A Thousand Ships by Natalie Haynes. So this is a new book, came out a few months ago in 2019, but it's a retelling of the tale of the Trojan War. Now, this being booktube, you probably all know the story of the Trojan War, and you know that it was Homer that wrote about it in the Iliad, and then the Odyssey, the story of one of the Greeks involved in the war, his 10-year journey home where everything goes wrong. So I'm not going to retell all that. But what I do find interesting is how much we go back to those Greek stories. And I was keen to read A Thousand Ships because about a year ago I read The Silence of the Girls, which is also a retelling of the story of the Trojan War by Pat Barker. It was quite a big book in 2018. And both of these books tell it particularly more from the perspective of the women involved. But what this first has made me think about is why is it we keep going back to the stories that were written maybe 3,000 or 2,500 years ago in ancient Greece? What is it that means they keep coming up again, particularly in Western literature? And I think it's because they cover eternal themes. So love and war and really dysfunctional family relationships and jealousy and revenge and power and arrogance, and also more kind of philosophical ones like free will and fate. Like, how much do we choose our actions and how much are we in the hands of wider forces? In the Trojan War story, the kind of the basis of the war, in theory, is that Helen, who was Helen of Sparta, runs off with Paris, who's a prince of Troy, becomes like the Helen of Troy that we've heard of, and because lots of other Greek rulers had wanted to marry Helen, they'd made this oath that if she was ever carried off by someone else, that they would all go and help retrieve her. And so when Paris seduces her, they all have to go and do that, and they get embroiled in this 10-year-long war. The fact that Troy was notoriously wealthy city in what's now Turkey may also have something to do with it, but the pretext for the war is about this story. Now, so there's Helen and Paris, the guilty parties, yeah. But then there's a sort of backstory set up that the gods decide to have this little competition, and they make Paris choose between Athena and Aphrodite and Hera, the three top goddesses, and all three of them try and bribe him, and Aphrodite bribes him with the promise that he will get the most beautiful woman in the world, and so he chooses her, and that woman is Helen. So after that, it's fate. Helen doesn't have a choice. Paris didn't really have a choice. It all just happens. Now, the Greeks were not silly. They were as intelligent as you and I. They didn't literally think that some gods did that, I don't think. It's more that they use those kind of explanations to look at, when people do stuff, is it like just a free choice? Do we have complete control over our choices, or are there bigger forces at work? And there's so many ideas in the Greek stories that we can kind of pick up on and reuse, and hence all the retellings. I think I'm thinking about Kamila Shamsie, her book Home Fire, that again was a big book about a year ago, 2017, 18, can't remember, but and she uses the story of Antigone, which comes up in a load of Greek plays, to look at issues around fundamentalism and family loyalties in a kind of 20th century Asian family. So yeah, old stories, but can be used for current resonance. So they have been retold again and again, quite literally, or new interpretations by generations in Western literature. sometimes on a more like elusive level, like just sort of as inspiration and ideas. Classic example would be James Joyce's Ulysses, which is of course not literally a retelling of, but kind of alludes to the Odyssey. Ulysses is the Greek version of the name Odysseus. Now I'm mentioning that because Ulysses is one of those books that I've always thought I ought to have read and I haven't. And Marc and Alan are doing a read-along of that this spring, and I will link to their announcement videos below, but I'm mentioning it here to commit myself. So now I've got to read it. It is going to happen. You can hold me to that. And this brings me to a question for all of you, which is, do you have books that you feel you ought to have read and you never have? And is that a silly way to think, given that we essentially read for pleasure, most of us, unless it's our job? Is it daft to think, oh, I ought to read that? Now, and Lukash, totally pretentious, just did a video about reading Ulysses after years and years of thinking he ought to read it and not getting around to it. I'll link to that as well. And my experience is that some of those books that I feel I ought to read but I haven't because I've been intimidated by them have turned out to be some of my best reading experiences, like Moby Dick springs to mind, for example. So maybe there is a reason why we should make ourselves get over those inhibitions sometimes and read those books we think are going to be a bit of a challenge. So if you want to name a book in the comments that you think you should get yourself to read in 2020, feel free. Getting back to what I've been reading though, I think, and again, correct me if you think I'm wrong, I think there's been a bit of a bubble of Greek retellings recently, and I think that this was maybe particularly kicked off by Madeline Miller's Song of Achilles that came out in, I want to say 2011, 2012. And so she goes to, well, Achilles is a key character in the Iliad, in the Trojan Wars. And he has a friend, Patroclus, and he's a bit of a sulky git, Achilles, and although the most amazing warrior, the top Greek warrior, and he it's a key plot point that he's really upset that his friend Patroclus is killed by the Trojans, and it's kind of, instead of him, or partly his fault, because he didn't go out there to fight himself because he was sulking about the Greek king Agamemnon taking a woman called Briseis. That's going to be relevant for the Silence of the Girls, so we'll come back to that. But what Madeline Miller did was she takes this bit that's a very central part of the Iliad, the bulk of the story, and she weaves the whole backstory around it as like a kind of gay love story between Achilles and Patroclus. Now that is a perfectly valid interpretation. In fact, Plato assumed that Achilles and Patroclus were lovers, so, fair dues to her. And it's a really, really readable book, Song of Achilles. If you haven't read it, you'll enjoy it. It's a page turner, but rich and interesting, full of ideas, and she's really good at trying to think, what would it actually have felt like to live in those times, a kind of mythical but sort of ancient Greek kind of world. And she introduces the gods, which you kind of have to in the story of Achilles, in a way that really works, and they don't seem silly or pointless, because I think that's one of the challenges of doing this kind of retelling. I think both Pat Barker in Silence of the Girls and Natalie Haynes in A Thousand Ships managed that fairly well. So we had Song of Achilles. Now maybe because that was a success, that helped some of these other ones get published. That's my guess. But if you're kind of in publishing, you may have a better idea than I. But some of the ones that I've read and enjoyed, and say if you have, was House of Names by the Irish writer Colm Toibin. That was a goodie. We had Natalie Haynes did a previous one that was Children of Jocasta, which is about the Oedipus story, and then the aftermath for his female family members, his wife Jocasta and his daughter and Ismene and Antigone, and Oedipus. Oedipus is the chap who famously manages to kill his father and marry his mother without realising it. Poor man, so unfortunate. That was a very enjoyable book. Then Madeline Miller did another. She did Circe, and in fact I have that here, and I'm going to wave this one at you. Circe is a character in, well, she plays a role in the Odyssey, Odysseus' journey back from Troy, where he takes 10 years to get home and gets into all sorts of pickles, including with Circe. And again, Madeline Miller grabs that and builds a whole story around it from the perspective of Circe the witch, and makes her, well, she's a bit more complicated than that, and a witch is perhaps an unfair way to describe her. Now, doesn't this have a gorgeous cover? And I'm going to admit to something here, which is I really like a book with a gorgeous cover. Does that make me shallow? I don't know. I think it's because I read quite a lot of ebooks now, and so if I'm going to buy an actual paper book, I quite like it to be an attractive artefact. Is that okay? Yeah, what about you? Anyway, Thousand Ships and Silence of the Girls. So, what did I make of them? Silence of the Girls by Pat Barker is a very readable book. It's very much from the perspective, like a few of the books that have come out recently, going back to these stories from the perspective of the women involved. Now, in the Greek stories, quite often, particularly, well, certainly in Homer, the women are key to the plot, but you don't really hear from them very much. That's slightly less true in Greek drama. Greek dramatists were more inclined to give women characters sort of speaking roles, but again, not always. So it's an interesting opportunity, I guess, to use the women's perspective, because it's a way of retelling those stories, reimagining them without just doing a literal retread. And in Silence of the Girls, Pat Barker homes in on Briseis, who's was a queen of one of Troy's allies, and she's captured in a raid that Achilles leads, and after the event she's given as a prize to Achilles. And Pat Barker's kind of mission in the book, is it good to have a mission in a book? Is that bad? But her mission is to say, okay, so these stories are all about these men running around waving swords and shields and being in chariots, and their honour and pride and macho stuff. But what about the women? What did it mean for them? And like Briseis goes overnight from being a queen to being a slave, and actually a sex slave, and she's kind of raped in effect by the man who killed her father and her husband. And that's an experience of lots of the women that in these stories. So she's really trying to get into that, and she does that well, really well. Being the writer that she is, Pat Barker, she can't quite resist also humanising her male characters. So, like, Patroclus is quite a sympathetic character. Achilles starts out not, but eventually she ends up kind of exploring his motivation, and he becomes a more sympathetic character. Now, which means she starts the book all through Briseis' perspective, and like it's a first person narrative, but then you have whole sections that move to the perspective, they're not first person, of Patroclus and Achilles, and that means she doesn't. I can see why she does that, and one reason is if she doesn't, then she has to keep having Briseis creeping around behind tents, listening into things so that she can cover enough of the plot that she wants to. But also I think it is that she does want to look at the impact of war on the men involved as well. And Barker as a writer is really interested in war, I think. It seems to be one of her ongoing themes, and she wrote this trilogy, the Regeneration trilogy, about the First World War, and if you haven't read that, please do. It's great. The first book in particular is about some of the World War I poets, and the impact of the awfulness of World War One on them. So that's a warm recommendation from me. And I would recommend Silence of the Girls as well. See if you've read it, but I thought she pulled it off. 1,000 Ships is a different book, and Natalie Haynes sets out to do something quite challenging, I suppose, which is to try and look at the perspective of all the women involved. So rather than homing in on one and then using that to tell the story from a kind of real central driving perspective. What Haynes does is she does the mortals involved, the Trojan women, the Greek women. She does like nymphs, the Furies, the Fates, and all the goddesses involved, and the muse Calliope, who is a recurring kind of theme in the book. Now, I like the fact that she wanted to do that, but it does create some challenges to the structure of the book. In a way, it's more like a whole series of short stories from different perspectives, or vignettes, and for the reader, that means, at least initially, that is a bit of a distancing thing, because you keep jumping to a different person, and that is, so it's a bit harder to connect. Now, I have to say, I hate it. I hope I don't lose any friends like this. I hate it when people say, oh, I couldn't read this book because there wasn't a relatable character and I need a relatable character. Well, it's a load of nonsense. You need to engage, a book needs to engage you, but you don't have to like the characters in it, or I don't feel that it's essential to relate to one key character, say. But having said that, those constant jumpings of perspective do mean that it takes longer to get into the book. And the other thing that it does is it causes some slightly odd shifts in tone in the book. So you have bits of the book that are more kind of like epic story, where the voice is quite almost like kind of a bit Homeric, or then you have other bits. There's a running thing through the book that's really enjoyable, which is Penelope's letters to Odysseus. Now, we know Odysseus is the one that takes the war lasts 10 years, and then he takes another 10 years to actually arrive home because he gets into all these adventures. Possibly because the gods make it happen, but Penelope certainly gets more and more irritated in these letters over the course of the 10 of the 20 years of, like, when are you ever going to come home, and why am I stuck here trying to run Ithaca and with a load of hassly young men trying to marry me because they think you're dead, for goodness sake, don't you want to be here? And they're great, but they're quite modern. And then you have other bits that really feel like she's taken them straight out of Greek drama, and I'll come back to that later. So it makes it variable. Maybe that's okay. Maybe that's part of what makes it interesting as a book, but it's not a kind of straightforward linear narrative like, say, Song of Achilles or Silence of the Girls. Ultimately, I felt that she pulls it off. I like this book. It gets a thumbs up from me. I think she pulls it off because what she does is she creates like a mosaic, and over the course of the books, enough of the stories, she comes back to enough characters more than once, and enough of the stories kind of interconnect, that you get an overall picture that works. Like, for example, we spend quite a lot of time with the Trojan women, including Cassandra, who is the daughter of the King of Troy, and then she winds up back in Greece as a prize again. This being carried off, raped, becoming sex slave theme that Pat Barker goes into, but she then is involved in the story of the murder of Agamemnon by his wife Clytemnestra, because she hates him for having sacrificed their daughter Iphigenia at the very start of the Trojan War. So there's enough of that coming together to hold you as a reader. I would be interested as to how it would work for someone who wasn't familiar with some of the stories already. I am, so I'm not sure. Whereas like Song of Achilles, I don't think you'd have needed to know anything else. I wonder with A Thousand Ships whether you need some pre-knowledge to help you gel it all together successfully. But a good book. One thing that I have to thank Natalie Haynes for, though, is as I was reading it, there were some bits where, particularly where you use it, she's with the Trojan women at the end of the war, and that's kind of recurs a bit in the book, and that really reminded me. I thought I know there is a Greek play that that is very similar to this, that she's really drawn from. And Natalie Haynes is a classicist. She's really enthusiastic about this because that's something that she studied and enjoyed. Now, I haven't read any Greek plays since I was at school and studied ancient Greek not very well. So what this made me do, which was brilliant, was go and have a little fish around and find some. And I found Euripides, Trojan Women, and I read that, and that was brilliant. I enjoyed it so much, and I can't believe that I haven't read anything like that for so many years, 40 years, and so maybe we should enjoy these retellings, but we should also venture out and read some of the originals. And with that thought, goodbye and have a good week.